The story I want to tell today is set primarily in 2010, although it actually spans three different generations over about 40 years. And it tells the story in a small way of the changing face of world mission, particularly through the eyes of some work in Angola. The story for me starts in 1999. At that stage, we were just in the process of moving to Mozambique, and we travelled to South Africa to do a Youth with a Mission discipleship training school at ETS. We were there for 3 months, and during the lecture phase, there was a Brazilian couple who were living and working in Angola who were staffing our school. Their names were Ishmael and Sibeli. They were my small group leaders, and I met every week for a one-on-one meeting with Ishmael. At that point, he was just learning English, so he spoke pretty broken English, and obviously Portuguese. And I spoke English and very broken Portuguese. But together we sort of bumbled along. We got to know each other well. And I really grew to appreciate and love Ishmael and Sibeli. At that stage, I heard some amazing stories about Angola, but I didn't really know the true calibre of the people that they were. But I got to know them more over the years. The second part of the story picks up, I guess, a few years later. It was 2007. We'd lived in Mozambique and we'd moved back down to Cape Town, and at that stage we were running a communication team for YWAM projects in Africa. I had the chance to travel with some friends to Angola for their 16th anniversary. It was a fantastic time visiting Ishmael and Sibeli in their homes and seeing some of the team. And then a few years later, 2010, I went back again, this time with a group of 4 people, and we spent 2 weeks in the country. And this really was a superb time. We had an epic journey. We probably drove 10,000 kilometres in those 2 weeks. We spent more than 100 hours driving. We visited several different locations around the country where YWAM teams and projects were running. Ishmael was our guide, and I got to know him well, and I saw the wide variety of some amazing work that they're doing there in the country. We were there primarily to make a video, and so we spent a lot of time shooting video, interviewing people, and then the following year, 2011, it was the 20th anniversary of YWAM, and we put together a magazine of articles about their work. Also in 2010, it was the 50th anniversary of Youth with a Mission Global, and our team was again doing a project for that. We put together what we called a Jubilee magazine, which told stories of YWAM's developing work over 50 years in Africa. Now, doing those 2 projects kind of at the same sort of time, it gave me, I think, a greater understanding of how mission work had changed with YWAM over those 50 years in Africa. In 1972, this is where the story really starts as far as Angola is concerned. In 1972, a young American man called Jim Steyer went and did a DTS in Los Angeles. Within 2 years, he had married his childhood sweetheart. His name was Pam, a Portuguese-American, and they felt called to move down in 1974 to start YWAM's work in Brazil. Now, at that point in the early 1970s and 1960, when YWAM started, World Mission was primarily people like Jim and Pam, Americans and other Westerners who had been trained in a Western setting, usually in a Bible college, who were being sent to the non-Western world to work. It was not what we see today, which is people from everywhere going to everywhere. This has been the big change of the last 5 decades or so. So in 1974, Jim and Pam moved down to Brazil. Jim says that we arrived speaking very little Portuguese. They had one-way tickets, little money, and he said he was plagued by self-doubt. You can read their story in his book, Against All Odds, which is actually a remarkable story of the growth of a mission movement in Brazil, of provision, pioneering, and amazing answers to prayer. They arrived in Brazil with a fairly simple, although very ambitious, vision. Their dream was to see a mission movement of Brazilians being sent out to the rest of the world. That was radical in the 1970s. Seasoned workers, who were mostly American or Westerners, told them, "You're headed for disaster. Brazil doesn't have a vision for missions." They were told that Brazilians wouldn't work for the church unless they were paid. They were discouraged. But they persevered, really, with a fairly simple dream. I'm putting these words into their mouths, but I think they would have been motivated by a simple understanding that when Jesus called the disciples to him, he said, "Come and follow me, and I will make you fishers of people." They recognised that in the discipleship, come and follow me, discipleship would naturally lead to sharing the mission of Jesus, being a fisher of other people. And so tied into their ideas of discipling Brazilians was releasing them and helping them grow in a vision for reaching the world around them. It wasn't simply discipling them for discipleship's sake. It was discipling them so that they would be fruitful. So they had this dream, and it became reality. Within 1 decade, 250 Brazilians had joined their YWAM team. By 1988, YWAM Brazil sent out its first team of 14 people to pioneer YWAM work on the African island São Tomé e Príncipe. And then, 3 years later, in 1991, a team of 6 was sent to pioneer YWAM work in war-torn Angola. And in that group of 6 were my friends Ishmael and Sibeli. The team of 6 was led by another young couple, Marcos and Marcia. Marcia later told me that when they arrived there, they were motivated by the life of Jim and Pam Steyer. She called Jim Jimmy. She said that Jimmy, through his life, taught us to be bold and fearless. We had learned from him that what mattered most was hearing the voice of God and then obeying him. Jimmy knew that we would make mistakes, but he believed in us, and it filled us with courage. As I've heard some of their stories from Ishmael and Sibeli, it's clear that they really had courage. They arrived in the middle of the Civil War. It was a 3-year drought. Angola at that stage in 1991 was the poorest country on earth. The only way they could get visas was through an NGO to work as aid workers in a refugee camp. So they worked in the camps, distributing food, discipling Angolans in their evenings, running discipleship programs, teaching in the churches. Jim Steyer later wrote to me for the magazine. He said that this team plunged themselves into the midst of dangers and the need, not thinking about themselves, but offering food to the hungry and the gospel of peace in the midst of violence. That was one of the most impressive examples of love I've ever seen. This love cost them. It was sacrificial. It was incredibly costly. Over the years, 4 Brazilians died or have been killed in the country. Sadly, Marcos died in that first decade in a car crash, and Ishmael took over leading the team. But they persevered, and the fruit of their lives over the last 30 years is remarkable. They arrived in Angola with the similar vision that Jim and Pam had had. They wanted to see Angolans released into world mission. I imagine they would have been discouraged in the same way that Jim and Pam were by the more seasoned people with older school views who would have told them Angola is the poorest country in the world. Angola doesn't send mission workers. But they had a simple dream. They ran their first discipleship training school in 1993. And there were 2 students in their early 20s on that school. Their names were Inácio and Idalina. They arrived with a 2-week-old baby girl. They took part in the lecture phase of the DTS with everybody else. And then when they went out on an outreach phase, they encountered an unreached people group called the Mukwando, living high up in the Serra das Neves mountains on an extinct volcano. After the DTS was finished, Inácio and Idalina moved onto the volcano. They lived there with that community for the next 12 years. A team grew up around them, and they simply responded to the needs that they saw in this subsistence community far away in a remote part of Angola, far away from cities, healthcare and schools. Together the team learnt the unwritten language, they created a written form of the language, they taught literacy to adults and children alike, they started the first school, they introduced healthcare, they started the first clinic, they even trained up local nurses and health workers. Inácio later told me, and I'm quoting him here, he said that people only began to respond to us after 2 years. They told us later that they wanted to watch to see from our lives if our message was true. After 12 years, they moved down off the mountain to an area at the base of the mountain, which is where they were when I visited them. And it was remarkable to sit with this couple, the same age as me, hearing their story. The local administrator, when I talked to him, he told me that their work had brought total transformation to the Mukwando people. There was another couple who I also met on this visit, Ignacio and Mila. They also, back in the 1990s, were a couple in their 20s. At that point, Ignacio was a soldier. He told me that one day he stumbled drunk into a church where somebody was preaching a mission message. He actually responded, drunk, to this message. A while later, he left the church sober and with a call to mission. The church didn't know what to do him, so they took him to YWAM, who they knew discipled young people for mission. Ignacio and Mila went through a discipleship training school, and afterwards they moved into one of the poorest barrios in the city of Lobito. They started working with street kids. They took 8 street kids into their home alongside their own 4 children and brought them up in a family. They started a preschool, and when I visited them, this preschool now had 80 children. The city mayor called it the best children's project in the city. As I travelled for these 2 weeks with my friend Ishmael, and we saw and met people like Ignacio and Mila, Ignacio and Idalina, and I heard these stories, it was remarkable. There were 60 plus Angolans within the YWAM team. They had paid a high price like the Brazilians had. They had worked sacrificially in difficult places in community development, working alongside unreached people groups. They had discipled, they had taught in churches. And these Angolans were seasoned workers, they were mature leaders. They were training the next generation. They had persevered in church planting. They'd worked amongst unreached peoples. They were establishing training centres. They were supported by local Angolan churches. And they were now partnering with international groups like Wycliffe in Bible translation for the Mkwando people. Quite remarkable. And as I saw the beauty of this, it really did make me reflect. I saw these 3 generations, the American generation from the 1970s with this passion to stir up Brazilians, and that coming to pass. And now Brazil is one of the biggest mission-sending nations in the world. And then in the 1990s, I saw this young generation of Brazilians going out into war-torn places like Angola and literally laying down their lives sacrificially in Angola. And the fruit of that in a 3rd generation of Angolans who are now faithfully and fruitfully reaching their own people and beyond. And I saw how world mission has changed. And this also made me reflect on my own life and my own place in this. I recognised that the place, I suppose, of the Westerner has changed. It's no longer that the Westerner is the central player in world mission, not by any means. And people like Ignacio and Idalina, Angolans, were culturally so much closer to the Mkwando people that they were the most effective people to cross that bridge. And the best role that my friends Ishmael and Sibeli could play was in encouraging them, mobilising them, helping disciple them and releasing them and letting them go and supporting them in that vision. And so I recognise that for myself, where I am today, often the most fruitful long-term investment, the most sustainable investment I can make is into the lives of other believers to help them be more effective at crossing the cultural bridges that are smaller gaps, to help them bear much fruit. Another thing that I reflected as I saw these amazing projects was just recognising that one thing they all actually had in common was that they displayed what I would call, and I think other people have called, the twin hands of the gospel of the kingdom. Good words and good deeds, hand in hand. Community development and church planting and discipleship. Mercy ministry and frontier mission. And in many places I've been in, Mozambique, Angola, Rwanda, Uganda, Madagascar, that the most fruitful, lasting kingdom projects I've seen seem to be ones where those 2 things are happening hand in hand. And so for me, this was a real, I suppose, an Ebenezer moment of seeing the long-term fruit of 3 generations who faithfully served for 10, 20 years in one area and gone deep and invested deeply into other people who have then gone on to disciple and invest deeply in other people who've then gone on to bear fruit. That multi-generational fruit of the kingdom of God, when people are living it out in word and in deed. That's beautiful. And that gives me great hope as I'm in challenging situations, that the people that I'm investing in will go on in the future to continue to bear much, much fruit in the kingdom of God.